Hello, my dear friends. They had to wash their private parts with strong alcohol, wipe them with rags, and then immediately receive another man. Every day, the smell of dried blood, semen, and sweat accumulated, and no one allowed them to take a break to bathe. If they were in pain, they would stay quiet. If they were dirty, they would endure, because the customers would still come. In medieval brothels, hygiene was not for them, but only to keep the regular customers. No mirrors, no clean water. No one asked if they were okay. Tonight, we uncover the raw and silent routines of hygiene that medieval prostitutes endured. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you really like what I do here. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soothing background, and let's embark on this journey together tonight. If someone thinks walking past a stable is unpleasant, they've probably never stepped into a brothel in medieval Europe. The door didn't creak open into some lively place like the stories say. It opened into heat and smell. That smell didn't drift. It came straight, full, and stayed. It was the first thing the girls met, before a bed, before a face, before a word. It was the thick, sour stink of old sweat, wine that had soaked into cloth, blood that had dried in corners, and something deeper that didn't have a name. Some turned pale right away. A few threw up in their sleeve. No one helped. The others just looked over for a second, then looked away. That was enough. Everyone had done it. Everyone had moved on. The floor was stone, but you wouldn't always see it. Layers of dirt, straw, stains. It changed colour from place to place. You learned to step around the dark spots, not because you knew what they were, but because you didn't want to know. The walls were smoked black. Lamps burned tallow. The smoke added another layer to the air. You couldn't clean it. You just lived in it. The new girl got a dress. Someone handed it to her without saying anything. It was never clean. The fabric stuck to itself when folded. It had old sweat in the seams and sometimes blood at the hem. It smelled like the others. That was the point. Underwear wasn't included. Some tied a rag if they had one. Most didn't. Feet stayed bare. Shoes wore out too fast. And no one gave you more. There was a basin in the corner, wide, shallow, and always full of someone else's water. That was for washing, not for bathing. Washing meant wetting the cloth, rubbing a few places, and being done. Face, armpits, and between the legs, same rag, same water. All day. It didn't make you clean. It just took off the worst layer. Sometimes there was wine or vinegar nearby. That helped with the smell. You dabbed some under the arms, maybe the thighs. It stung if you had scratches, which you probably did. It's strange to think that burning your skin a little was still considered better than smelling like what you actually lived in. Beds weren't real beds, just a straw on the ground, maybe with a cloth sack over it. If there was a blanket, it was shared. If there was a pillow, it was someone's folded dress. The straw was always damp near the bottom. Lice came fast. Fleas were already there. The smell never left. Some girls lit dried herbs and waved them over the straw. It helped for an hour. Then it was back. There were no mirrors, no windows. One candle for 10 girls. When it burned low, that was the night. The heat didn't come from fire. It came from the bodies. 10 or 12 in one room, breathing, sweating, coughing. No one talked after lying down. Just a few groans. Scratching. The creak of someone turning over. The slap of a foot on stone when someone stepped away to use the bucket. The bucket sat behind a curtain, if there was one. It was full by morning. Emptied when someone remembered. If it tipped, it stayed tipped for a while. No one cleaned the floor. Just avoided that corner. The smell built up. By the third day, the new girl didn't flinch anymore. Meals were bread. wine, and stew if it was payday. Fingers only. Rags weren't changed between wiping and eating. She might still be using the same cloth to wipe her legs that she used yesterday. No one noticed. No one mentioned it. There was always more important work waiting. Her hair was a mess by the second night. No brush, no oil. She tied it back with a string or tore a strip from the edge of the blanket. If lice came, and they did, she might shave her head. Others just rubbed ash into the scalp. It helped a little, but not for long. Water wasn't for hair, it was for wiping. There was never enough. The mouth was worse. No one had anything for teeth. Some chewed on mint leaves or pine twigs. Most didn't. Lips cracked. Gums bled. Some rubbed salt. Some did nothing. Breath smelled of hunger and wine and bad meat. If someone walked in today with that breath, they'd get kicked out of a cafe. Back then, it meant you still had your teeth. Periods didn't stop the work. Girls bled into rags, folded and reused, washed when they could, often not. The smell was stronger then, but no one said a word. You worked, or you were replaced. If the cloth slipped, you reached down and fixed it. If it stained the straw, you turned it over. Hands stayed cracked, feet were raw, knees bruised, fingernails bent backward. Cuts from combs or from men's buckles didn't get bandaged. They just dried out. If infection came, it came. If it didn't, you were lucky. The shock faded in days. The smell became the air. The rags became part of you. You folded the same dress every night, knowing it was still damp. You shared the same basin, knowing it would never be emptied. You slept in a corner that smelled like someone else. You didn't talk much. Not because you were scared, but because there was nothing left to say. What struck me most is not that they got used to it, but how quickly they stopped noticing. After a week, no one could tell who was new. The smell evened out. The dress blended in. The hair looked the same. You moved more slowly. Not from age, but from weight. Not body weight, just the weight of the room, the air, the filth, the habit. No one told them to adapt. They just did it because they had to. Next, we'll look at how these women were taught to stay clean only for the men, and how even that kind of cleaning came with pain. Nobody explained why. They just showed her where to stand, what to use, and what not to forget. A cloth in one hand, a jar in the other. There was no mirror, just the back of a metal bowl, bent out of shape. She leaned forward and wiped as they told her. First the front, then between the legs, then again, just to be sure. That was what mattered, being sure, or at least smelling like it. The jar held a thick liquid made from fat and herbs. It didn't clean anything. It sat on the skin, covered whatever was underneath. The smell was strong. It helped if the girl had been working for hours, helped cover what no amount of water could reach. She dipped 2 fingers, rubbed fast, and put the lid back on. That jar was shared. Everyone used it. Sometimes it had hair stuck inside, sometimes dirt. She didn't look too close. Someone handed her a twig. She was told to chew it. That was for the mouth. There was no brushing, no rinsing. The twig had a bitter taste. If she chewed long enough, the end frayed. That was what she used to rub her teeth. It didn't help much. Her breath still smelled like whatever she'd eaten, or whatever had been near her face the night before. If breath mints had existed, they would have been worth more than gold in that place. They told her to smile sometimes. Not always. Only when the man liked it. That meant she needed lips without scabs and teeth that weren't brown. If she had sores, she was told to bite her lip to hide them. If her teeth were loose, she didn't open her mouth wide. That was enough. Looking clean was more important than being clean. Hair was next. They showed her how to tie it back, not for comfort, for access, for looks. It had to be off the neck, behind the ears. Not tangled, but not perfect. Some rubbed oil to make it shine. Most didn't have oil. They used their sweat, or rubbed fat from the food bowl. A few added dried flowers. It made them sneeze, but it looked nice. She didn't have time to wash it. No one did. The water was cold. Drying took too long. Wet hair got you sick. Sick girls didn't work. Sick girls were replaced. So she tied it up with twine and moved on. Under her arms, they told her to rub vinegar. If there was no vinegar, then wine. If there was no wine, then a damp cloth. Anything to take away the smell. It didn't work, but she did it anyway. Habit formed quickly in that room. It wasn't about the result. It was about showing you tried. There was a small cloth for wiping after each client. It hung near her bed. She rinsed it when she could, dried it by the fire if she was lucky. Most of the time, it stayed damp. She used it anyway, rubbing fast, then hiding it under the blanket again. If someone else took it, she used her sleeve. If her sleeve was wet, she waited until morning. They said nothing about her comfort, only what men noticed. Men didn't like hair, so she shaved. No one gave her a razor. She used a piece of metal, dull and chipped. It pulled more than it cut. The skin bled. No one cared. The point was to look smooth, not feel okay. If she missed a patch, someone noticed. If she bled too much, she covered it with a cloth and waited. It wasn't hygiene, it was maintenance, like how someone polishes a tool they don't care about as long as it works. They told her to smell like herbs, but the herbs ran out, so she used crushed leaves, sometimes dried hay, rubbed them into her skin until the scent took hold. It didn't last. The room ate smells and replaced them with its own. Still, she tried. Every morning, every night, even when her arms ached. Some girls hid garlic in their dress seams, not to smell better, but to cover something worse. If a man didn't like the scent, he left. If too many were left, the girl got punished, so garlic stayed. Some tried lemon peel, some tried charcoal, some burned cloth and let the smoke cover their body. The tricks kept changing. The need stayed the same. If a girl was seen as too clean, she got other kinds of clients. The ones who thought she was special. That meant more pressure, more pain. Some girls stopped trying. They let the smell come. It kept the worst men away. Sometimes, other times, it didn't matter. The instructions never stopped. How to sit, how to breathe, how to act like she had no smell, no dirt, no sores. She nodded and did as told. Not because she believed it helped, but because doing nothing felt worse. What I remember most is how cleaning turned into performing. It wasn't for her. It was part of the service. Rubbing, wiping, tying, brushing. All done in silence. All done in the same order. Every girl. Every day. Some wept the first few times. Others didn't. After a while. Even crying felt like extra effort. You just did what came next. Then I lay down and waited for morning. The cloth didn't get softer. The vinegar didn't sting less. The twig didn't freshen the mouth. But the motion stayed. They became the rhythm of the room. Each wipe, each rinse, each stroke of the hand along the leg or behind the ear. It didn't care. It wasn't self-respect. It was a checklist. They were taught to be clean in the same way furniture is dusted. Not because it matters, but because someone else will be looking. Next, we'll look closer at how bathing was handled when everyone shared a single basin, and why even that small act brought its risks. There was only one tub. It sat in the back room, half sunk into the ground, made of old wood bound by rusted iron hoops. The surface was no longer smooth. Splinters stuck out near the rim. Stains ran down its side like dried sap. No one asked where the water came from. They only knew that when it was there. It didn't stay clean for long. The first girl in had the best of it. She scooped from the top, quick and quiet. The water might still be clear then, or at least not too cloudy. She worked fast, not for privacy, but because she knew what came next. As soon as she stepped away, the next girl dipped in, stirring everything up. Hair, skin, old soap scum, bits of cloth, maybe blood. If someone had a wound, the water held it. If someone had just finished work, the water absorbed that too. There was no order, just whoever was bold enough to push forward. The quiet ones waited longer and got the worst. At the bottom, the water turned thick, cold, heavy. A greasy film floated on top. Bits of leaf, loose strands of hair, and streaks of reddish-brown floated with it. They didn't scrub. There were no brushes, only hands and scraps of cloth. They wiped the parts that mattered, if they could. Sometimes they rinsed only their legs, sometimes just between the thighs. There wasn't enough water or space for a full wash, and if you lingered, someone would complain, or worse. Imagine going to a spa where the luxury is sharing someone else's dirt. Only this time, you paid with your health, not your money. There were days the tub went untouched, not because the girls didn't need it, but because the water smelled too strong, like rotting wood and sour oil. Someone had used it after bleeding. No one said it loud, but they all knew. The house mother still made them line up, one by one, no excuses. You wiped what you could and pretended not to gag. The water wasn't changed each time. That would waste firewood, and firewood costs money. Instead, someone poured in a new bucket now and then to freshen it up. It just made the murk deeper. One girl tried boiling herbs to add to the mixture. She got slapped for wasting them. Herbs were for selling, not bathing. The floor was always wet. The boards warped from years of soaking and trampling. Slime built up between the cracks. If you stepped wrong, your foot would slide. They kept an old rag near the door to wipe the worst puddles, but it was never enough. Slips and falls were common. No one offered help. You cleaned up and got out of the way. Compared to today, when even public gyms have individual showers, this was closer to livestock care than human hygiene. There was no towel. You used your dress if it was nearby, or let the air do the work. Girls stood around, dripping quietly. Some pulled their arms in, trying to stay warm. Others just stared forward, waiting for someone to leave so they could move. Steam never rose in that room. The water was never hot. If it had warmth, it faded by the time the third or fourth girl stepped in. Privacy didn't exist. You saw everything. Scars, bruises, infections. Some girls avoided eye contact. Others looked openly, maybe to see who was worse off. The youngest usually cried the first few times. After that, they stopped reacting. Eyes dull, mouths tight, movements slow. It became routine, just another chore. Nobody taught them how to clean properly. They did what others did, rubbed what others rubbed, used the same corner of the same rag, even if it smelled. No one said the word infection. No one used soap unless a client had left some behind. Even then, it was used sparingly and mostly for the front parts. If a girl took too long, someone knocked on the wall. If she tried to leave before going in, she got dragged back. Clean was relative. It didn't mean spotless. It meant passable. If the next client didn't complain, it was good enough. If he did, the girl paid later, in bruises or lost work. What stayed with me wasn't the filth, but how quickly we got used to it. You stop noticing when everyone smells the same. They said nothing when a girl bled into the water. They said nothing when a rash spread down someone's leg. They said nothing when a scab opened and floated for a moment before sinking. Silence was easier than shame, and shame didn't help you earn anything. Some girls tried to bathe at night, when fewer eyes watched. But the water was colder then, stiff with whatever had settled. If they made noise, they got scolded for waking others. If they lit a candle, they had to return it afterward, and even if they got there first, the tub wasn't empty. It had never been emptied properly, not for months. Over time, the skin began to itch. Small sores formed under arms, between fingers, in creases that no one could reach well. They scratched in private, hid the flakes, avoided asking questions, because asking meant someone might see, and being seen meant being judged. Or removed. When the smell got too strong, someone threw straw on the floor, not to clean, just to cover. They swept it out once a week. Maybe. A rat had drowned in the tub once. They fished it out with a stick and used the water anyway. That was the way it worked. The water was there. You used it. Or you didn't. Either way. No one listened when you spoke about it. That wasn't what mattered. You were supposed to get in, clean up, get out, and make room for the next girl. Next. We'll move on to the clothing they were forced to wear again and again, and how each stain held more than just a colour. Not everyone noticed it right away, but eventually the clothes told their own story. The dresses they wore, day after day, held on to more than just fabric creases. These garments soaked up everything, from sweat and bodily fluids to the lingering scent of every man who had touched them. Some of these women had only one gown. It was their working dress, sleeping dress, and sometimes even their burial dress. The fabric wasn't just worn out. It was stained in ways no soap could fix and smelled of a dozen nights. Changing clothes wasn't really an option. New garments cost more than most of what they earned in a week, and the owners of the brothels didn't hand out spares unless there was a death. Even then, the new dress might have belonged to someone who had just collapsed the day before. If a woman did try to wash hers, she couldn't use good soap or fresh water. A quick rinse in a bucket and a squeeze on the stones outside would have to do. Then she would hang it near the alley where chickens wandered and chamber pots were emptied. That was considered clean enough. It's hard to imagine wearing the same dress soaked in old fluids. But that was the norm, not the exception. And it wasn't just about cost. There was superstition mixed into it too. Some believed that regular clients grew used to the smell of a particular woman's dress. They came back not just for the face or the voice, but for the scent they had grown familiar with. It was like a poor man's perfume, worn not on the skin, but stitched into every fold of wool or linen. Changing that too suddenly might drive the client away. So women were told not to make their clothes too clean, not to smell too fresh. Familiar dirt, they said, was better than strange cleanliness. Ironically, the few who tried to smell better often got into trouble. A dress that smelled too floral raised suspicions. Where did she get the perfume? Was it stolen from the madam's stash or worse? Was she hiding something? A wound? A disease? People whispered fast, and in a place where trust barely existed, being too clean could be just as dangerous as being filthy. Women learned to strike a balance, dirty enough to blend in, not so dirty as to drive customers off. In a modern context, that's like being punished for using deodorant at the office. And then there were rules about the actual act of cleaning. You couldn't take too long. You couldn't ask for extra clothes. If someone spilled oil or wine on your dress, you weren't supposed to complain. You were expected to keep moving, to serve the next man, to act like the stain didn't matter if it smelled stronger than usual. Just tie a scrap of fabric around your waist. If it sticks to your thighs in the heat, just ignore the discomfort. In that world, practicality always won over dignity. There were no pretty undergarments or fresh linens. Most of the time, they wore nothing underneath. Some even cut slits into their skirts to make the work faster. After all, they didn't have time to undress and redress for every man fully. That would slow down business, and time was money. Every second between one man leaving and another knocking was counted. The idea of washing something until it felt truly clean was foreign. Nobody had extra hands to scrub seams or scrape off old wax or blood. The madam didn't care, as long as the customer didn't walk out the door, and the customers, many of whom weren't exactly fresh themselves, rarely noticed or mentioned the condition of the clothes unless it was overwhelmingly bad. One man's filth was another man's comfort. It's strange how, in that setting, hygiene wasn't just neglected, it was actively discouraged. On some days, the dresses got so stiff with dried residue that the fabric could stand on its own for a moment after being removed. Women would shake them out in the alley like rugs, dust flying everywhere, bits of straw and dried herbs falling from the folds. Then they'd step right back into them, like slipping into a memory they couldn't erase. Some tied belts around their waist to hold the fabric up, not for fashion, but to keep it from dragging through the filth on the floor. They didn't wear shoes indoors. Many walked barefoot through dirt and spilled liquids. When they lay down, the same hem that had touched the floor all day now curled around their legs on the bed. Their own skin rubbed against the grime that had been collected from dozens of others. But no one spoke of it. They simply got used to it. Even in colder months, they couldn't wash and hang a dress without risking it staying wet for days. A damp garment in the winter meant chills, rashes, or worse. So they often chose to leave the dress as it was, letting time dry the spots, letting the air soften the edges. In the rare event that someone brought new fabric or a gifted dress, it was either stolen or hidden away. Wearing it would draw attention, and attention was rarely safe. Sometimes, on quieter mornings, a woman might take a moment to shake out her dress and pick off clumps of hair or hardened oil. That was her version of care, a private act, not for beauty, but for survival. A cleaner dress might earn her a slightly better paying customer, or maybe just a moment of feeling more like a person and less like an object. But even that was fleeting, because the dress was never really hers. It belonged to the job, and the job did not stop for laundry. What stayed with me most was how quickly a woman's own body became just another surface to wipe clean. No matter how stained, no matter how foul, the dress was still expected to do its part. It had to keep up the appearance of function. It had to hold itself together just like the women inside it, and so the fabric sagged. The threads loosened, the colours faded, the smell deepened, and day after day, night after night, the dress returned to work. Up next, we'll take a closer look at what passed for menstrual hygiene in this world. Spoiler, it was neither clean nor private. There was no exception for certain days. No matter what their bodies were going through, the women were still expected to work. Periods did not stop the customers from coming, and so the women had no choice but to keep going. Whether their wombs ached or not, they were not offered rest. They were not excused. The expectation was cruel and straightforward. Do your job, even if you are bleeding. They used whatever was available. There were no manufactured products or proper clothes made for this purpose. Most settled for torn rags, usually already stained from prior use. These were not fresh pieces of linen, carefully cut and washed. They were scraps of discarded fabric, sometimes taken from old bedsheets, sometimes torn off the hem of a ruined dress. Once folded thick enough, the rag was tucked between the legs, held in place by the weight of their undergarments, or, more often, by nothing at all. Imagine being forced to continue physical labour while a filthy wet rag shifts between your legs. These rags absorbed little. After only a short time, they grew damp and heavy. The sour smell of old blood mixing with whatever perfume or oil had been applied to the body earlier in the day. The longer they were used, the more likely they were to shift out of place. It was not rare for the rag to fall out completely during a visit from a client. In those cases, the women had to reach under themselves, retrieve it silently, and go on without a word. Sometimes they could rinse the cloth in a corner bucket and try again, but most of the time, they just continued without it. The embarrassment was private because no one else cared. Not the client, not the madam, not even the other girls who were too busy with their own struggles. Blood on the sheets was just part of the job. If the stain was noticed, someone might toss a layer of cloth over it before the next man arrived. If not, the next girl lay in it. No one had the time or energy to argue about what was clean and what wasn't. The rags were rarely appropriately washed. The women might rinse them quickly in a basin, then hang them to dry on a rope by the hearth or out the back window, in damp seasons. They stayed moist for days. They picked up mould and took on a stiff texture, but were used again anyway. There were no replacements, even if they asked. The answer was usually the same: figure it out yourself. Modern women complain when the store runs out of their preferred brand. Here, they made do with whatever cloth didn't already smell like death. Many suffered infections, vaginal burning, constant itching, sores that wouldn't close, but unless it interfered with the ability to serve, It was ignored. No one examined them. No one offered herbs or poultices. In some brothels, the only treatment was vinegar or wine poured over the area to clean it out. The sting was excruciating and often made things worse, but there was no alternative. Complaining was discouraged. Suffering was assumed. They were told to stay silent. Weakness was frowned upon. If a girl said she was in too much pain, the others looked away, afraid of being associated with someone who might be thrown out. Being dismissed wasn't dramatic. It just meant she was told to leave, and another girl took her place that night. No farewell. No coin for medicine. Just the end of a name spoken. I can't help but feel that many of them didn't even know what was wrong with their own bodies. Some bled longer than they should have. Others stopped bleeding entirely. Their cycles grew irregular from stress, starvation, and constant physical strain. But none of this mattered to those around them. Their bodies were expected to be usable, regardless of the internal damage. A woman who bled too much risked being labelled as ruined. One who bled too little might be assumed infertile or diseased. There was no winning. To try to cope, a few of them tried creative measures. Some stuffed dried moss into their undergarments. Others used layers of crushed herbs to dull the smell. A handful even attempted to sew simple pads using leftover scraps from discarded dresses. But these makeshift solutions never lasted long. The moss dried and crumbled. The sewn pads grew stiff with repeated use and were thrown away. The herbal coverings helped for a few hours, but then just blended into the general mess. Privacy was impossible. The shared rooms meant that others could see or smell what was happening. A woman trying to change her rag in the corner might be watched by two others waiting their turn with a client. No one spoke of it, but the silence carried the weight of shame. They all knew. They all understood. They just didn't talk about it. The worst moments came during the busiest nights. When the door never stopped opening, when the women had no time to clean themselves, no time to check if the rag was still in place. There were stories of women fainting mid-visit, pale from pain or blood loss, and being dragged into the back room to lie down for a while. Sometimes they got back up, sometimes they didn't. The floor under the beds often carried the proof. Dried drops of blood, scraps of cloth that had fallen unnoticed, the smell of iron that no candle or incense could fully cover. By morning, it mixed with everything else, with wine, with sweat, with the smoke from the hearth. The stench settled into the wood. It was part of the room, part of the job. It wasn't neglect, it was resignation. They didn't believe anything better was possible. No one asked if they were comfortable. No one gave advice on hygiene. The girls learned from each other, sometimes passing down methods that had worked a little better for someone before, but mostly they just endured. Even now, when I think about it, I can't decide what's worse, the physical discomfort or the total lack of care, to bleed in pain and be expected to smile through it, to be told to adjust the rag and move on. There was no end to the bleeding, only brief pauses between shifts. And when those rags finally wore too thin to hold anything, they became tinder for the fire, their last use kindling for someone else's warmth. Coming up, we'll look at how something as simple as a razor became a daily tool for damage, blunt blades, raw skin, and the constant pressure to appear clean. Not every injury came from the men. Some of the worst ones came from their own hands, or more specifically from the blades they were told to use. Shaving was not optional. The women were expected to remove all visible hair on their bodies, especially in the places where men looked most. Hair meant unclean. Smoothness was part of the illusion they had to maintain, no matter what it cost their skin. They had no proper razors. What they used were old copper blades, sometimes dull, sometimes chipped. Others made do with thin pieces of scrap metal or broken knife edges. These tools were not made for precision. They cut roughly and unpredictably. The women often had to press hard or go over the same area repeatedly, just to remove the stubborn patches. Skin was scraped raw in the process. Nicks were common. Bleeding was routine. If pain made you flinch, you weren't cut out for the job. There was no shaving cream, no soap to soften the follicles. Most didn't even have warm water to rinse with. Oil could have helped, but it was considered a luxury reserved for the customer's pleasure, not the girl's comfort. A few tried to use spit or leftover fat from the kitchen to get the blade to glide more easily, but the result was still uneven. The skin turned red, then swollen, sometimes hot to the touch within hours. Rashes formed quickly. The constant friction of movement didn't help. Their thighs rubbed together all day, trapping sweat and dust and any bacteria that entered through the open scratches. They were told to shave regularly, even daily if possible. Clients expected it. A woman with visible stubble might be called filthy or unkempt. The expectation was clear: be smooth, smell pleasant, and act inviting. No one cared how that was achieved. It was a rule like any other, enforced more by pressure than violence, but just as unbreakable. Nowadays, people throw out a whole razor if it tugs once. Back then, they just kept cutting. Some women bled so often that they no longer reacted when they saw the streaks. They wiped the red away with the back of a hand, then carried on. A cloth might be pressed between the legs to soak the spot. Then it was back to work. There was no healing time, no bandages, only a kind of practiced tolerance. You did what needed to be done. The worst were the infected cuts. A small nick could swell overnight, turning purple and oozing pus. The women knew what this meant. Pain when sitting, pain when walking, pain when touched. Some attempted home remedies, a splash of wine, a dab of crushed herbs, or even ash mixed with water. But these solutions were unreliable. Infections spread, sometimes up the thigh, sometimes deeper. Still, they worked. Stopping was not allowed. The shaving ritual was usually done in a corner of the room, using a bit of water poured into a bowl. A cloth served as a mirror substitute. They could only guess by touch and habit where the blade had passed. Some helped each other, especially the younger ones who hadn't yet mastered the balance between speed and care. Accidents happened often. It was common to hear a hiss of breath or see someone press their fingers quickly over a fresh wound. I don't think most of them felt clean after shaving, just relieved it was over, until the next time. Not every woman shaved completely. A few left a thin strip or shaped the hair to appear more styled, depending on what the men preferred, but even then, the hair was trimmed as close as possible. No one wanted to be known as the one with a coarse patch. Reputation mattered. So did competition. One girl's unshaven leg might cost her a client. That meant no food, no protection, no favour from the madam. In the hot months, things worsened. Sweat made the skin sting. The shaving wounds didn't dry properly and stayed moist for hours. Flies and gnats hovered around the irritated flesh. Some women wrapped thin linen strips around their legs, hoping to keep the bugs away. Others simply tried not to move too much between visits. The act of shaving became mechanical, a thing to get through quickly before the first client arrived. No one viewed it as self-care. It was damage control, maintenance of a product. Their bodies weren't their own. They were surfaces to be kept presentable, like furniture in a cheap inn. Some even shaved their arms or necklines, depending on how much skin they planned to show. The blade travelled across collarbones and along the edge of the jaw. One slip could mean a visible scar. Still, they kept doing it. Some grew used to the feeling. Others never did. The new girls bled more than most. They hadn't learned where not to press too hard yet. There was no disposal for old blades. They were reused until they rusted or broke. Then someone found another shard. Some women wrapped their blades in cloth to keep them sharper longer. Others simply stored them loose in a drawer or under the mattress. Cuts from sleeping on them were not unheard of. They didn't talk about the pain. Shaving was just another step in the routine, like combing your hair or brushing your teeth. If either of those had also come with open wounds. One girl was known for having steady hands and would sometimes help the others. She shaved in silence, never reacting to the blood. She was respected, even if no one said it. Eventually, the body stopped healing as quickly. Cuts took longer to close. The skin lost its elasticity. Some women gave up and let the hair grow back. Those were the ones who stopped caring whether a client returned. Most didn't last long after that. Coming next is the story of how they tried to clean themselves after every visit. No bath, no time, just whatever they could grab in a hurry to wipe away the evidence. Even when the men left, the discomfort remained. The women still had to find ways to clean themselves, though clean wasn't really the right word for it. They didn't have access to fresh water, soap, or proper clothes. What they had were rough options that stung more than they helped. The goal wasn't hygiene in the sense of health. It was about removing visible traces. No blood, no semen, no smell that would offend the next man in line. Some of them used alcohol, not the kind anyone would drink willingly. It was rough, unfiltered, and burned on contact. A splash of that between the legs was their version of a cleanse. The sting was immediate. Many clenched their teeth or held their breath when they poured it on. It didn't matter how raw the skin already was. Pain was expected. No one asked if it was too much. That wasn't the concern. Others used salt water, a pot of hot water, often left over from boiling rags or food scraps, would be mixed with a generous handful of salt. They would squat over it, holding their skirts out of the way, and try to rinse thoroughly. Sometimes they poured it from a small clay jug. Other times, they dipped a cloth in the mixture and pressed it directly to their skin. The burn was more severe when cuts or ulcers were already present. Who needs enemies when your cleaning routine feels like punishment? There was no privacy during these moments. Women shared corners of rooms or narrow back spaces behind the brothel. There wasn't enough light to see clearly. They did it quickly, quietly, sometimes still half naked from the last customer. It wasn't about feeling refreshed. It was just a reset, a way to look acceptable enough for the next one. Between each man, they barely had time to breathe. Most couldn't afford to rest. So after a rushed rinse, they simply patted themselves dry with the same cloth they used all week, one that had long since stopped absorbing much. If there was no cloth, they used the hem of their dress. Then they stood up, adjusted their clothing, and waited. Infection was common, but they didn't have the words for it. There was just an ache, a heat, a swelling that wouldn't go away. Some of them walked with a limp by the end of the day. Others started to avoid sitting between clients. They adapted because they had to. No one taught them another way. Some women tried to make their mixtures, crushed herbs in warm water, ash stirred into vinegar, or even honey diluted with beer. They heard from someone who heard from someone else that it might help, but most of these things just irritated the skin further. Still, anything was better than nothing. At least they felt like they were doing something. Today, people panic over a mild rash. These women bled daily and called it normal. There was no set rule for how to clean yourself after sex. The brothel didn't provide a schedule or checklist. The girls learned by watching others, by doing what worked fast, what didn't attract complaints. If a man said he smelled something bad, she might lose her spot for the night, or worse, get blamed for driving away customers. The older girls gave advice, but it wasn't always kind. Use more salt, hold it in longer, don't flinch. They said things like that because they'd already stopped hoping it could feel better. They knew the body wasn't built to heal fast enough when used like that, but they also knew no one cared. For some women, the repeated burning became so common that they stopped reacting to it. They would wince slightly, then carry on. The skin around their thighs and groin grew dark and leathery. It lost sensitivity. That was a small mercy, but even numb skin could break open under pressure. There were no medical checkups, no ointments or creams, no soothing baths, just the same routine every day. Work, rinse, wipe, repeat. By the end of the week, some women had to lie down between clients, not because they were tired, but because standing made the pain sharper. I don't think they believed in relief anymore, just in surviving until the next moment. A few women tried sitting in cool water when it was available, but water wasn't clean. It was usually the same basin that had been used for others earlier. Floating hairs, flecks of blood, pieces of leaf or dirt. It didn't soothe. It just spread the irritation around. Sometimes, out of desperation. They did nothing at all, just wiped with a dry cloth and hoped no one noticed. This often led to stronger smells and more severe infections. But what other choice was there if a client left angry? She might be punished. If she cleaned too slowly, she might be called lazy. There was no safe way to get through the day. The scent of strong alcohol often clung to their thighs, not from drinking, but from rinsing. Some tried to mask it with oil or herbs tucked into their skirts. But nothing lasted long. After 10 minutes of sweat and friction, the smell returned. They got used to it. They told themselves it was better than nothing. Over time, the repeated damage built up. Scar tissue formed. Some girls could no longer bear the rinse. They faked it, splashing water nearby just to be seen cleaning. Others cried silently while doing it, especially the young ones who had not yet gone numb. And yet, despite all this, the expectation never changed. A woman had to be clean enough to be touched, but not so clean that she seemed like she was trying to be better than the rest. If her skin smelled too much like perfume, she might be accused of stealing. If it smelled like salt and iron, she was just one of many. Next comes the story of their hair. Not the glossy, cared-for locks you might imagine, but tangled strands crusted with sweat and other things they never had the time or tools to remove. There was one part of the body they stopped bothering with sooner than most: the hair. Not because it didn't matter, but because it simply wasn't manageable anymore. Long shifts, rough hands, and filth from men left more than bruises. It clung to them, literally, from the scalp down. At some point, they just let the hair go. Washing it wasn't easy. Water was cold and scarce. Most of the time, they just bent over a bucket and dumped what they could find. There were no soaps designed for hair. They used whatever was on hand, sometimes even coarse sand or ashes, to try to scrape the grease off. Some rubbed their scalps raw with their fingernails, scratching until the skin bled. The build-up of oil, sweat, and skin flakes turned into thick crusts that only came off with pain. The smell was always there. Hair holds scent longer than skin, and there soaked up every odour from the brothel candle wax, mould, old wine, and worse. No amount of rinsing could truly remove it. It followed them even when they left the room, at markets, in alleys, on church steps. People turned their heads, not because they were whores, but because they stank like one. If shame had a scent, it probably smelled like damp scalp and stale sex. They tried to braid it, tie it up, cover it, but it kept sticking to their necks. In the summer, the heat turned their heads into dripping messes. In the winter, it froze stiff, sticking out in unnatural angles by morning. They wore scarves, not for fashion, but to hide how bad it had gotten. Some women gave up completely and cut their hair off, not all at once, and not cleanly. They tore at tangles until whole clumps came loose, or they shaved it with broken blades. The stubble grew in patches, and they felt cold at night, but at least they didn't have to deal with lice crawling behind their ears. Lice were a constant companion. There wasn't a single woman who hadn't scratched her scalp bloody at least once a week. They learned to live with the bites, the crawling, the eggs stuck at the root. Picking them out one by one took too long, so they stopped, and just like with everything else, they let it settle. Another discomfort added to the pile. Combs were shared. 5 or 6 women passed around a wooden one. It was never cleaned, teeth broken, worn smooth with oil and dirt. Anyone watching closely could see the strands from 3 different heads wrapped in it. They didn't have time to pull them out. The goal was to yank through their knots and move on. People today complain about split ends. These women would have killed for a tangle-free day. Hair got tangled with everything. Not just dirt, but the work itself. Some women had strands glued together with semen. Others had blood dried in patches that refused to come loose. When they tried to pull it out, more hair came with it. The bald spots weren't hidden anymore, and no one pointed them out. Everyone had them. They didn't wear perfumes or oils in their hair. Those were luxuries reserved for the upper class. At best, they had a pinch of lavender if a generous client left some behind. But even then, it barely made a difference. One night in the brothel was enough to wipe out any attempt at fragrance. Wearing head coverings helped a little. It stopped the worst of the looks when they went outside. But inside, the clothes came off, and the truth showed: matted curls, greasy layers, tufts missing from rough handling. Some women brushed their fingers through their own hair and gave up halfway. Too tired to keep going. I think hair became a symbol of what they couldn't control anymore. They used to care. When they were younger, they braided their hair before bed. They took pride in the length, the colour, the shine. But after a few seasons in the brothel, no one asked any more if it looked good. It just had to be out of the way. Older women advised the younger ones to keep it short. Less chance of pulling, less chance of tangling. One girl even burned off the bottom half of her hair after catching lice for the 5th time in a month. The smell of singed hair filled the brothel for hours. No one commented. Everyone understood. Scalp infections were common. No one had the tools or time to clean them. Open sores became part of the routine. They stopped reacting to the pain. It was just another thing to bear while kneeling or lying flat. Some women covered the worst patches with ash to dry them out. Others just pressed a cloth to the spots and hoped they wouldn't drip during work. Between the heat, the friction, the dirt, and the constant touching, no part of their head didn't hurt by week's end. But they couldn't complain. The men didn't want to see that. They wanted the illusion. And that illusion didn't include bald spots or weeping sores. Hair was supposed to be part of a woman's charm. But here, it was just one more problem to manage in a place where no one had energy left. Some women tried to smile when brushing it, pretending they still cared. But the mirror was long gone, and with it, the habit of checking their reflection. Next, we'll take a closer look at how they dealt with their mouths. Not with words, but with rotten teeth, cracked lips, and breath no rinse could fix. The mouth was a battlefield. They fought on every day. They didn't have toothbrushes. They didn't have dentists. And no one taught them how to care for their teeth. What they had was desperation, tricks passed down from other women, and a constant fear of smelling too real. They knew what men expected. A mouth that seemed clean, a kiss that didn't stink, but their lives didn't match those expectations. What came out of their mouths often wasn't just words. It was the lingering taste of old wine, the metallic bite of blood, and the smell of decay that no one wanted to acknowledge. To cover the worst of it, they chewed whatever they could find. Mint sprigs if they were lucky. Wild ginger roots if someone brought them from outside. Parsley, dried cloves, even bitter wood bark, all passed from mouth to mouth until the sharpness numbed the tongue. They didn't chew to refresh themselves. They chewed to survive inspection. You can call it breath freshening if you like, but it was more like masking rot with something slightly less awful. They would scrape their teeth with sticks. Some broke twigs into sharp little tools and rubbed the surfaces of their molars. Sometimes it helped remove leftover food. Sometimes it just made their gums bleed more. The sticks weren't cleaned, of course, and the wounds festered. Their gums were swollen almost constantly. Red, puffy, tender to the touch. Just the act of speaking too much could cause bleeding. They'd spit pink into the dirt and move on. There wasn't much choice. No one cared if they were in pain. The job had to be done. Blood or no blood. Charcoal was another trick. Crushed into powder, then smeared on the teeth with a cloth or finger. It made their mouths look black at first, but after rinsing, it left the illusion of cleaner teeth. Not white, not bright, just a little less yellow. It didn't fix the problems underneath, but it distracted from them. And distraction was everything. These women learned to smile carefully, not wide, not open, just enough to look pleasant without revealing the rotting molars or the holes where teeth used to be. Lips pressed together tightly hid more than just silence. Lip colour was added with old, dried pigments, sometimes crushed berries, sometimes brick dust. Sometimes. The mixtures made their mouths crack at the corners. They applied it with fingers, no mirrors, and hoped it didn't smear too fast. After hours of talking, kissing, and panting, the pigment dried into flakes that cut their skin open. In a world without lip balm, beauty came with cracked skin and sore corners. Cracks bled in the cold. Infections followed. Some had sores that never healed, making eating painful and drinking difficult. But again, they didn't stop. They covered what they could with cloths, or simply turned their heads away when breathing near clients. Tooth loss happened early. By their 20s, many had gaps along the sides or front. The back teeth went first, rotted from the inside until they simply fell out. The front ones chipped or loosened from rough treatment or grinding in their sleep. And since there was no replacement, they just learned to live with soft diets and careful chewing. Bad breath wasn't occasional, it was constant. The kind that hit others before they even opened their mouths. A mix of gum disease, decay, and food remnants that had no business staying in a human body for that long. The women knew it. They weren't blind to the disgusted looks or the subtle flinches from certain clients. But they also knew the solution wasn't in their reach. No one was going to hand them a mint. No one was going to offer a rinse. All they could do was chew what they found, rinse with stale ale or old well water, and keep their distance when possible. Some women tried to clean their tongues with rags. Wrapped around a finger, the rag scraped the white film from the surface. It made them gag sometimes. Others just rinsed and spat, hoping it was enough, but the results never lasted more than a few hours. Modern mouthwash ads promise fresh breath for 12 hours. These women would have settled for 12 minutes. There were moments of shame. Not all of them were numb. Some still cared what they looked like. Some tried to keep their lips from drying out or asked around for fresher herbs. But every time they cleaned up, the next client dragged them right back into filth. The mouth became another place of pain, another thing they had to fake. Smiles, moans, whispers. It was a tool, not a part of them anymore. It performed, and then it rested in silence, sore and swollen, until the next night. I think the worst part wasn't the bleeding or the rot. It was knowing that no one cared unless it interfered with their service. As long as they looked acceptable on the outside, the inside didn't matter. A few tried to hide the missing teeth with clever mouth positions, a tight-lipped smirk, a bowed head, laughter into a sleeve. But those were tricks that stopped working when drunk men forced their mouths open. Then it was all visible. The missing rows, the red gums, the tiny clumps of food are still stuck in molars that shouldn't be there anymore. No one offered comfort. No one asked if they were all right. At best, another woman might pass along a bit of ginger or a cloth to wipe the blood. That was the extent of compassion. Their mouths were tired from pretending, from stretching too wide, from holding back cries when the pain surged. But they did it anyway because there wasn't a choice. Coming next, we'll move lower again, to the skin, the constant itch, the cracks, and the stink they never quite escaped. The face could be hidden with powder or kept in shadow. The hair could be covered with cloth, but the hands had no such luxury. They were always visible, always busy, always touched, grabbed, or used. And in those hands, the reality of their lives was carved more deeply than on any other part of their body. Their fingers cracked from repeated rubbing, the skin around the knuckles peeled or hardened. At the end of every shift, their palms stung from wiping themselves down with rags soaked in alcohol or water mixed with ash. It wasn't for hygiene, it was for appearances. There were no soaps made for women like them. What they had was whatever made things look less filthy than they were. Ash was easy to get. Some had access to strong wine or sour ale, which was poured onto a rag and scrubbed across the hands until the smell of others faded. But the alcohol didn't clean. It dried, and after weeks, months, years of this routine, their skin began to split. In medieval brothels, hand sanitizer came with splinters and blood. The backs of their hands grew rough, some spots hardened like bark, while others remained tender and thin. In cold weather, the skin broke open. In hot months, sweat made the cracks sting even more. They kept working. Fingernails were rarely whole. They snapped on wood, tore on clothing, bent backward under pressure. No one trimmed them properly. No one cared. The sharp edges turned black with dirt, with dried fluids, with the grit of whatever was left behind after a night's work. There wasn't time or reason to clean under the nails. They were tools, not ornaments. Once in a while, someone would bite hers off, a nervous habit, or just the fastest way to remove what was bothering her. That only led to infections, swollen cuticles, and sometimes pus beneath the skin. But even then, they kept using those hands. Their fingers often smelled of smoke, blood, and sweat, all baked into the skin. Washing helped very little. The rags were reused, the water shared, and the effort never quite reached the base of the problem. If a man today found a date's hands in that condition, he'd probably call pest control before he called again. But back then, clients didn't notice or didn't care. Their attention was elsewhere. Hands were expected to perform, not to please. They were supposed to be useful, not attractive. If the nails were jagged or the skin flaking, it made no difference to the outcome. Some women tried covering their hands with cloth, tying strips of linen around their fingers or palms, but these wraps got dirty quickly, and if they wore them while serving customers, it often raised questions or suspicion. So they stopped. Infections started small. A little swelling, a red patch, a soreness at the base of a nail. Then came the heat, the pus, the fever. Some women had fingers that turned dark, a few of them, but those were the worst cases. Most simply lived with constant irritation, bandaged with whatever they could tear from old clothing. No one gave them ointment. No one handed them salves or oils. They rubbed animal fat or cooking grease on the skin when they could, not for healing, but for softness. It helped hands move over skin more easily and reduced friction during work, but it didn't treat the damage. Their joints ached from cold floors and repetitive movements. Some hands trembled when resting. Others became stiff in the morning and only loosened up after working. These weren't the hands of young, idle girls. They were the hands of women whose entire lives had been compressed into labour, done in dim rooms on hard beds. When I imagine them now, I don't see silk or perfume. I see fingers too tired to bend, nails hidden by dirt, and palms that had forgotten what softness meant. You could tell a lot from how a woman held her hands. Some curled their fingers inward out of shame. Some kept them in their laps. Others folded their arms, hiding the worst of it beneath their sleeves. But no matter how hard they tried to hide it, those hands told the truth. The smell never really left. The mix of body, oil, blood, and whatever else passed through them each day soaked into the cracks. Even after a rinse, even after a scrub, it clung. Some rubbed herbs into their palms, mint, thyme, rosemary. It masked the worst of it for a while, but it didn't erase anything. Over time, they stopped noticing the pain, the stinging when touching cloth, the burning when rubbing rough fabric. Their nerves adjusted, or maybe they just gave up caring. The damage became part of the routine. Some younger girls came in with smooth hands, soft and pink from farm work or home chores. Within weeks, their fingers became as rough as the others. The change happened fast. It always did. The brothel had its own way of stripping the skin not just from the body, but from memory. They still used those hands to help one another, to wipe tears, to brush hair, to hold trembling arms. Even when bleeding, even when shaking, they reached out. The world may have seen them as ruined tools, but among themselves, they knew what those hands had carried. The worst wasn't always visible. Sometimes the pain wasn't in the skin or the nail, but in the feeling of being touched without wanting to be, having to grip when they wanted to pull away, holding still when everything inside screamed to move, and yet, the next night, they used those same hands again, to work, to survive, because they had to. Next, we'll move inward past the skin, into the air they breathed, and the diseases no one talked about but everyone feared. They could hide the cuts on their fingers, they could tie a cloth over a sore wrist or wrap something around a swollen ankle, but there was one place they couldn't protect, couldn't avoid using, and couldn't speak about. Between the legs and around the inner thighs, the damage was constant, and it was the kind of pain that no one ever asked about, because no one wanted the answer. The skin in that area was never given time to heal. Every day, it was pulled, pushed, pressed, or rubbed. They sat on hard surfaces. They moved with speed when asked. They adjusted their bodies for different men, sometimes dozens in a row. And in all that movement, that tight space between the thighs took the brunt of the friction. If medieval brothels offered a loyalty card, the reward would have been permanent skin damage. Some women developed thick, dark patches of skin along the crease where their thighs met their groin, not from dirt, but from pressure. That discoloration stayed, no matter how much they washed. Other times, it wasn't thickening, it was the opposite. The skin thinned and cracked. Open spots where the fabric rubbed too long or too hard, or where sweat had made everything softer, easier to tear. Many wore nothing underneath, just a dress, maybe a thin slip, sometimes not even that. When they bled, the fabric absorbed the blood. When they itched, they couldn't scratch in front of others. When it burned, they said nothing. A few walked with stiff legs, not because of modesty, but to avoid the feeling of skin rubbing against itself. They had no ointment, no cream. Some rubbed goose fat or oil, but that only worked if they had it. Others used spit, others did nothing. Boils formed, blisters, small, red nodules that turned into sores. Some burst on their own, some were scratched open in the night, some became ulcers that didn't close. The smell was hard to ignore, even for those used to every other bad smell in the place. But they kept working. In today's world, one trip to the gynecologist would solve it. Back then, you'd be lucky to get a piece of clean cloth. Sometimes it wasn't just the skin. Lymph nodes near the groin swelled. A dull ache turned into a sharp pull each time they moved their legs. But if they limped, they risked punishment. If they asked for rest, they were told to tough up. There was no reward for honesty, no sympathy for pain. They were expected to function. They were expected to stay silent, even if walking hurt, even if sitting stung, even if lying down sent a jolt through the nerves in their hips. A few tried to cushion the area. They rolled old cloth into bundles and tied them between their legs when they could. But that only caused more friction, and once it soaked through, it became useless. Worse, if they were seen adjusting it or hiding it, they could be accused of infection, theft, or weakness. What surprises me most is not the wounds themselves, but the way they were carried like secrets, buried beneath skirts, denied even in whispers. The bruises didn't fade, they just changed colour from purple to brown to green. Some looked like fingerprints, some like smudges. The skin around them remained tender, and the bone beneath ached. But no one marked time by how long it took to heal. They measured it in shifts, in the nights, in bodies. It was common for women to press a hand to their thighs as they sat down, not for modesty, but to brace for the sting. Many flinched without realizing. Some gripped their skirts tighter than they meant to. These little movements said everything, even when no one dared speak. When new girls arrived, they learned quickly. A few days of work, and their legs began to mirror the others. The burning, the soreness, the dull pain that followed them from bed to basin and back. They didn't ask for help. They copied what they saw. They learned which movements to avoid, how to sit with knees slightly apart to reduce rubbing, and how to breathe through the pain. Infections developed in those wounds. Some climbed into the groin and stayed there. A few developed hard lumps that never went away. Others ended up with fevers that took them down in a matter of days. Still, nothing changed. In the rare case a woman collapsed, the others would carry her to the side, wipe her with a cloth, and let her rest until she could return. There were no doctors, no healing herbs are reserved for them. The priority was always who was next in line, not who was bleeding underneath. They weren't allowed to talk about it, not because it was shameful, but because it would be inconvenient. Men didn't want to know. Matrons didn't want excuses. The only time their groins were discussed was when something looked abnormal, something suspicious. Then they'd be questioned, maybe even thrown out. So they kept the damage to themselves. They walked slowly when no one was looking. They washed gently if they had the chance. They folded the cloth and prayed it wouldn't rub more skin away. At night, they lay on their sides, not from comfort, but to keep pressure off the most damaged areas. When they woke, the soreness returned instantly. There was no recovery, only repetition. Some began to avoid sitting altogether. They leaned, they stood, they shifted constantly to find the least painful position. Others became so used to the ache that they forgot what it felt like to move without pain. Even in death,